Well, I'm really happy to be part of this conference, and thank you everybody here really for showing up the last session of like 3 full-day conference. The title of this session is Transnational Politics, right? And what I want to do today is to bring your attention to the hidden venue and modality of transnational politics. So not remittances, not electoral politics, not even the subjective belonging to the imagined community of the nation, but the kind of a belonging to the documented community of the nation, the micro-political struggles in bureaucratic settings. Well, over the last 2 decades, as a reaction to the receiving state bias in the immigration studies that we sort of talked about in the first keynote speaker session, scholars have shown growing interest in the membership politics concerning the relationship between the state and its all kinds of external members. So that could include diasporas, immigrants, or ethno-national Kim population in Central Eastern European contexts. I consider this diverse range of phenomena broadly as transborder membership politics, which I would just simply call TMP for this presentation. My paper examines the dimension of the TMP underexplored so far. I focus on how the historically evolving bureaucratic practices shape the contours of TMP over time. And I will flesh out my theoretical claims through the empirical analysis of 2 contentious TMP involving South Korea and ethnic Koreans in Japan and Northeast China. My theoretical interest in the role of bureaucratic practices is derived from my 2-pronged approach to the politics of identity. The study of transnational politics shows that being a homeland state or being a member of the transborder nation is not self-evident ethnodemographic fact. It is precarious, arduous, and revocable political achievement. Accordingly, the questions of classification, identification, and boundary crossing are important in TMP. What I want to highlight is that this politics of identity actually have 2 components. On the one hand, it involves struggles over group definition. That is, struggles over how to define the boundary of a certain transborder member category. So for instance, if the Indian government wants to issue people of Indian origin visa or card, right, they have to define the sort of the boundary of this category, what it means to be the people of Indian origin. But the politics of identity has another hidden dimension, and it involves struggles over individual identification. And by this I mean struggles concerning an individual's claim to belong to that particular category, however the boundary of the category is set up in the first place. The former struggles over group definition, usually develop in the legal, political, and public spheres, and the latter struggles unfold in various bureaucratic settings. Struggles over group definition about this sort of category have been the major preoccupation of the literature on ethno-racial boundary making and also identity politics, including TMP. How do we define Jews in Jews' relationship with Israel, for instance, or how do we define the category of Germans in their relationship with Germany when it involves immigration to Germany, etc. I argue that there is great analytic purchase to be gained by focusing on struggles over individual identification. First, the micropolitics of individual identification enables us to examine whether the states have the infrastructure capacity to correctly assign individuals to the state-defined categories. For instance, whether a person's national membership is determined by the jus soli or jus sanguinis principle would mean very little if there is no adequate bureaucratic structure that can verify who is born to whom and where. Second, the micropolitics of individual identification enables us to conceptualize the agency of the transborder population in a more dynamic way, because they can challenge the state's categorical scheme in 2 ways. So on the one hand, they can propose alternative views about how they should be classified as a group. On the other hand, instead of challenging the state's categorical scheme up front, they can also deliberately misrepresent their individual identities and induce misclassification from the state's perspective. For instance, forging a birth certificate could be an example of this type of micropolitical struggles. I developed a set of general theoretical arguments about how bureaucratic practices contribute to the making, unmaking, and remaking of the homeland state and the transborder nation. And I'm going to just present them in sort of 3 points. First, bureaucratic procedures constitute the conceptual grid through which the state identifies its own transborder population. To borrow anthropologist James Scott's term, these bureaucratic practices make the transborder population legible to the homeland state. Second, bureaucratic procedures mediate the encounters between the state and the transborder population, and by doing that, these practices come to shape the vernacular idioms of self-identification of the transborder population. Lastly, bureaucratic procedures leave durable documentary traces. A state turns to this quote-unquote memory of the state to validate the belated claims to national belonging by those whose long defunct ties to the homeland state seem ambiguous or suspicious. These all sound a little too abstract, so rather than elaborating on each point in depth, I would like to show how the empirical cases at hand flesh out these theoretical arguments. So let me offer some historical context here. Japan's occupation of Korea at the turn of the 20th century set in motion a massive outmigration of the colonial population to other parts of the empire. Post-war repatriation left 0.6 million in Japan and 1.2 million in now communist China. Some of you may know that Korea is often considered the paradigmatic case of a homogeneous ethnic nation. Nonetheless, the embrace of these transborder co-ethnic populations by the two post-colonial states, North and South Korea, has been selective, shifting, and recurrently contested. My forthcoming book examines this dynamically shifting transborder relationship from the comparative and historical perspective. My current paper zooms in on two contentious episodes. First, and I'm going to be rather brief about this case, I will discuss South Korea's effort to create its own docile citizens out of ethnic Koreans in Japan in a fierce competition with North Korea. Second, I examine South Korea's effort to control its membership boundary from ethnic Korean quote-unquote return migrants from China. And I draw on archival and ethnographic data collected during 18 months of multi-sided field research in South Korea, Japan, and Northeast China between 2005 and 2009. Okay, let me begin with the first case. The transition from the empire to the nation state in post-war Japan entailed a radical exclusion of former colonial subjects from the newly constituted citizenry. The Japanese government just basically stripped Koreans from citizenship, making them stateless, and this certainly created a big political vacuum for the V-man competition between North and South Korea. North and South Korea employed divergent transborder nation building strategies to produce their own docile citizens out of this opaque and recalcitrant stateless population who were deeply ambivalent toward the initiatives of the two inchoate post-colonial putative homeland state. North Korea's strategy was to represent itself as a safe haven in which Koreans could find an escape from the hostility and discrimination experienced in Japan. The repatriation campaign on the one hand and hefty investment in Korean ethnic enclaves, especially Korean schools, exemplified this strategy. Thanks to the successes on both fronts, North Korea garnered much stronger support than South Korea for decades. And this is all the more surprising if we consider that over 80% of Koreans in Japan were originally from the southern part of the Korean peninsula with their families back in the southern part. South Korea's strategy was markedly different. It fashioned itself first as a broker that could facilitate the integration of the Korean minority into the Japanese mainstream. For example, the Japan-South Korea bilateral treaty in 1965 pushed the Koreans to officially identify themselves as South Koreans. It was because the treaty made available permanent residence status only to those who obtained South Korean passports or nationals abroad certificate from the South Korean consular office. South Korea also served as a gatekeeper that could control Koreans' engagement with their families or home communities back in the southern peninsula. For example, the South Korean government obstructed those who refused to align themselves with South Korea from any kind of meaningful contact with the family back home. The government also refused to issue them family registration documents and passports. The family registration documents were essential for various administrative and legal proceedings in Japan. The key here is the control of the bureaucratic persona was critical for South Korea's transborder nation building strategy. Instead of shaping the soul of the people through schools, the classic nationalist strategy adopted by North Korea clearly, South Korea targeted their paper identity. Well, this may seem like too minimalistic an approach to transborder nation building, paper identity. But this strategy enabled South Korea, which was initially an underdog in this competition, to press conversion and prevent defection very effectively. Through these various bureaucratic practices, the South Korean state could identify opaque populations beyond its border and define their state membership according to its own preferences. It could also distinguish docile Koreans from the subversive and mobilize the former for its own ideological and developmental agendas. I would be happy to elaborate more on this point later, but for now, I would like to move on to the second case, which concerns the post-Cold War period. The post-war and Cold War trajectory of Koreans who remained in Manchuria was starkly different from that of Koreans in Japan. The Chinese Communist Party actively incorporated Koreans into its multinational state-building project. The government granted Koreans Chinese citizenship and the official ethnic minority status. And there was almost no contact between Korean Chinese community and South Korea under the Cold War. But this situation began to change in the late 1980s with remarkable economic development in South Korea and rapid incorporation of post-Mao China into the global capitalist economy. The ensuing influx of a large number of Korean Chinese migrants into the rediscovered affluent homeland as labor migrants became the focus of TMP throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. Unlike other comparable cases of ethnic return migration, like Germany, Israel, Spain, Italy, you may know better those cases, the post-Cold War South Korean state did not widely open itself to Korean Chinese migrants. It instead built multiple gates to regulate this flow. Korean Chinese migrants challenged the gatekeeping practices of the homeland state in two ways. Again, struggled over group definition and struggled over individual identification. My paper examines the latter struggles in bureaucratic settings. And for complicated reasons that I cannot really get into now, these struggles focus on establishing the authenticity of Korean Chinese kinship ties with the South Korean citizens. Just basically, Korean Chinese migrants became entitled to a range of benefits in immigration and citizenship if they could demonstrate these kinship ties with the South Korean citizens. But how to verify the existence of these kinship ties? The South Korean state at first relied exclusively on official documentation. Migrants who claimed to be related to native South Koreans had to submit decades-old, like colonial era family registration documents. Those who claimed to be related to naturalized South Korean citizens, that is, Korean Chinese migrants who somehow had obtained the South Korean citizenship earlier, had to submit an official Chinese document. But somehow, most of these documents were difficult and often impossible to obtain, even for legitimate applicants. It is related to the infrastructure capacity of the colonial state. In principle, the colonial state was supposed to document all Koreans wherever they were. But obviously, the colonial state had lacked the administrative capacity to document the colonial subjects in Manchuria exhaustively and correctly. Many records, therefore, were missing or incorrect. Migrants also had difficulty establishing their kinship ties to naturalized South Korean citizens. Issuing related official documents was up to the discretion of local bureaucrats in China, and obviously it was not quite easy. As a result, many Korean Chinese turned to the black market to buy forged documents or other people's documents. Or they bribed local Chinese bureaucrats to issue the documents they needed, genuine or not. Well-prepared fraudulent documents were often accepted without difficulty, whereas genuine claimants were denied entry visas, work permits, and citizenship because of their inability to provide proper documentation. Fraud will work, truth won't became a mantra in Korean Chinese communities. Ironically, the state's reliance on the paper reality that it created and also authorized made official documents vulnerable to false reporting, fabrication, and impersonation. The protests of Korean Chinese migrants and their increasing involvement in the so-called fraudulent behavior undermined the legitimacy and also the efficiency of this verification regime. In response, the South Korean state began to introduce other types of evidence. These included a detailed narrative statement and supporting documents, such as family genealogy books, letters exchanged with South Korean kin, old photos taken with these kins, and their endorsement letters. Applicants were also required to appear for interviews, and immigration officers tested their knowledge about alleged kin and looked for affinities in appearance between alleged parents and children. But as a wider range of evidence was accepted, applications for entry visas, work permits, and citizenship skyrocketed. This seriously overburdened the consular officers and immigration officers. Some Korean Chinese found the revised procedure to be just as arbitrary and prolonged as the original one. The comment of one of my informants nicely captured the paradox inherent in the verification regime that really relies on the sort of performance of the applicant. So basically, he could not really remember the birth date of his 4 children. He is in his 70s, and this triggered the official suspicion about the authenticity of this particular kinship relation. And my informant lamented, if there are those who can perfectly answer such questions without hesitation, the officer should be suspicious of them because they are the ones who memorize all those details to disguise who they truly are. In this context, the DNA test came to have a particular appeal to both immigration bureaucrats and Korean Chinese immigrants. To immigration bureaucrats, it was an effective remedy for fraud and a convenient tool to speed up the review process. But somewhat surprisingly, the DNA test was also an attractive alternative to Korean Chinese migrants. It was expensive, but the test drastically reduced the waiting time from a few years to a few months. The test was also particularly appealing to those whose applications have been turned down repeatedly because of all kinds of trivial errors in their documents. And biometric information was also seen as a powerful weapon in their fight against unjust exclusion from the ancestral homeland. Somehow this particular genre of identification, DNA test, seemed to embody the idea that the Korean Chinese entitlement to membership in the affluent homeland state was kind of natural and authentic, whether or not it was supported by the artificial documents. So I don't really have time to really sort of summarize my findings and sort of discuss the theoretical implication, but just basically what I want to argue and emphasize here is the bureaucratic practices that have not been really examined in many boundary making studies and transborder membership politics really require our attention because these bureaucratic practices provide a crucial institutional scaffolding for TMP. They enable the state to define, identify, and even create, as in the case in Cold War Korea and their relationship, Korea's relationship with ethnic Koreans in Japan, a certain transborder population as its own, and also transform newly immersed borders and unfamiliar state categories into the experiential reality of ordinary people. And my paper has paid sustained attention to the struggles of transborder populations on the micro-political levels. And these sort of findings suggest that micro-political struggles that unfold in bureaucratic settings should be given more attention in the study of immigration, citizenship, and transborder membership politics in a comparative and theoretically informed manner. Thank you.